So what does the Bible consider to be adultery? This is Pastor Wagner and it's my weekly video blog. A lot of people have some misguided ideas today of what adultery actually is, and I used to also years ago before I knew. A lot of people think that as long as you get divorced and the state puts the rubber stamp on it, then you're free to go and marry somebody else, and there's no adultery. The only time it would be adultery is if you are married, legally married, and you go and have some kind of an affair, have sex with some other woman or man, and then that would be the act of adultery. But as long as you're divorced, it's okay. But that is not what Jesus said, and it's not what the Scripture said. The thing about adultery is that it is a lifelong covenant. You can see it in the book of Malachi. It talks about the wife of thy covenant. Job said, I made a covenant with mine eyes. Why then should I think upon a maid? Marriage is a covenant. Anybody that's ever entered into it understands that. They stand there and before God they take vows that they will remain married, be sexually faithful to this person for the rest of their life. So the Scripture says that in Romans 7 and verse 2, it says, For the woman which hath an husband is bound by the law to her husband as long as he liveth. But if the husband be dead, she is loosed from the law of her husband. So then if while her husband liveth she be married to another man, she shall be called an adulteress. But if her husband be dead, she is free from that law, so that she is no adulteress, though she be married to another man. So that verse is very plain. When a woman enters into a covenant, or a man enters into a covenant with a woman, that person is bound by the law of God to that other person for life. And if, in this case with the woman, if she is married to another man while her husband lives, she shall be called an adulteress. It doesn't matter if a divorce has taken place or not. If she marries another man while her husband's alive, she's an adulteress. But if her husband be dead, she's freed from that law. All right? Jesus said, likewise, if you look in Matthew or in Mark chapter 10, Jesus really tightened up the laws for divorce when he came. Prior to his coming, the Israelites were allowed to put away their wives for virtually any cause and marry somebody else. But that's not the case under the New Testament. Jesus said in verse 9, speaking of marriage, what therefore God hath joined together, let not man put asunder. And in verse 11, he saith unto them, Whosoever shall put away his wife and marry another committeth adultery. And if a woman put away her husband and be married to another, she committeth adultery. Very plain. If you divorce your wife or you divorce your husband and you marry another, you are an adulterer or an adulteress. Very plain. Now there are two exceptions to this rule. If you look in Matthew chapter 19, a parallel text of this, Jesus adds a little more, or a little more information is included in this of what Jesus said. It says in Matthew 19 and verse 9, I say unto you, whosoever shall put away his wife, except it be for fornication, and shall marry another, committeth adultery. And whoso marrieth her which is put away, doth commit adultery. Now there's a slight change in that from what he said in Mark. He said the same thing. Mark just didn't record it all. Matthew recorded the whole thing. You see there's an exception clause here. Except it be for fornication. Let's read it without the exception clause and see how it reads. Without that it would say, Whosoever shall put away his wife and shall marry another committeth adultery. But you put the exception clause in there, and look how it reads. Whosoever shall put away his wife, except it be for fornication, and shall marry another, committeth adultery. That tells us if you put away your wife and you marry another, you commit adultery. But if there's fornication involved, if the wife committed fornication, which is adultery, look it up, definition, Oxford English Dictionary. Fornication is voluntary sexual intercourse between a man and unmarried woman, and then it says in Scripture extended to adultery. So fornication is sex outside of marriage, period. So if the wife in this case commits adultery or fornication, sex outside of marriage, the husband can put her away and marry another, and he will not be considered an adulteress or an adulterer. The same way it would work with the wife. If the husband committed adultery, she could put him away, marry another, and be free. And it also works with the person that's put away. If a husband puts away a wife, and then you marry that woman that's put away, you commit adultery. That's what it says. Whoso marrieth her which is put away doth commit adultery. So that's the first exception. If your spouse is unfaithful to you, you can put him or her away, and marry another without being guilty of adultery. The second exception is in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. This is a chapter that Paul devotes largely to marriage. And he says there in 1 Corinthians 7 that people ought to stay married together. And if they do depart, or if they do separate, they must remain unmarried. He says that in verses 10 and 11. Unto the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord. Let not the wife depart from her husband, but if she depart, let her remain unmarried, or be reconciled to her husband, and let not the husband put away his wife. So if believers separate, or if anybody separates that's married, they can separate, they can divorce, but they must remain unmarried. And they must remain sexually faithful, which means celibate, to their spouse. They cannot be having sex with anybody else or marrying anybody else. But he says concerning a believer married to an unbeliever, there's a special exception that God makes here. It says in 1 Corinthians 7:15, but if the unbelieving depart, let him depart. A brother or a sister, which is a believer, a brother or a sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God hath called us to peace. So if a believer is married to an unbeliever and the unbeliever departs, the brother or the sister, the believer, is not under bondage. And Paul tells us what the bondage is in verse 27. He says, art thou bound unto a wife? Seek not to be loosed. Art thou loosed from a wife? Seek not a wife. Art thou bound unto a wife? The bondage is the marriage covenant. So if you are a believer married to an unbeliever, the unbeliever departs the marriage, you are free. But that's the only other exception. It's adultery, it's the unbelieving departing, or it's death. Those are the only three things that can free you from a marriage covenant and allow you to remarry without being guilty of adultery. So thanks for listening. I'll talk to you again next week.